This feeling of isolation did not arrive because you failed to belong, and it did not appear because something is wrong with you. It appeared because your internal timing shifted before your environment was ready to meet it. Most people assume isolation is a social issue, but what you are experiencing is perceptual distance. You are not separated by walls or personalities. You are separated by pace. When awareness moves faster than the structures around it, connection thins, not as punishment, but as physics. And if this resonates, it means you crossed a threshold most people never consciously reach. Not because you tried, not because you studied, but because something in you stopped needing noise to feel real. Being ahead does not feel like victory. It feels quiet. It feels like standing in a room where conversations repeat themselves, patterns recycle, and urgency feels misplaced. You may still care, still listen, still show up, yet something fundamental no longer hooks you the way it once did. That is not detachment. That is orientation. Your system has moved out of reactive synchronization and into observational coherence. And when that happens, familiarity begins to dissolve. The roles you once played no longer fit, not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. This is why the isolation feels so specific. It is not loneliness in the emotional sense. It is the absence of resonance. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Not because they lack empathy, but because they are operating inside timelines you have already completed. And the most disorienting part is that there is nothing to fix, no explanation that will bridge the gap, no adjustment that will restore the old closeness without costing you clarity. If you are here now, hearing this, it means you are early, not broken. And early always feels empty before it feels aligned. This is not the end of connection. It is the pause before a different kind of resonance becomes possible. What most people never realize is that advancement separates before it connects. This is not a flaw in the process. It is the process itself. When your perception reorganizes, it does not immediately grant you new connections. It removes old synchronization first. Human connection is built on shared reference points, shared urgency, shared assumptions about what matters and why. When those references dissolve inside you, even slightly, the invisible glue that once made interactions effortless begins to loosen. Conversations still happen, relationships still exist, but the internal sense of mutual orientation fades. Not because anyone has done anything wrong, but because alignment has shifted at the level where meaning is generated. Most people are still operating inside reactive loops. Their thoughts are shaped by repetition, their emotions by momentum, their decisions by inherited narratives about success, fear, belonging, and identity. These loops are not inferior, they are simply earlier stages of organization. They rely on constant reinforcement from others to stay stable. When you move beyond them, even partially, you stop feeding those reinforcement cycles automatically. You no longer mirror urgency just to maintain harmony. You no longer perform certainty to feel included. And without realizing it, you begin to exist at a different frequency of engagement. This is where separation begins, quietly and without drama. Being ahead does not mean you have more answers. Often it means you have fewer compulsions. You are no longer driven to react immediately, to choose sides quickly, or to define yourself through opposition. This neutrality can feel threatening to systems that depend on polarity to function. People may sense that you are not fully participating in the same game anymore, even if they cannot articulate why. They may interpret your calm as distance, your silence as judgment, or your lack of urgency as disinterest. In reality, your system has simply slowed down enough to see patterns instead of chasing outcomes. Timing is the real divider here. Two people can share values, history, even affection, and still feel disconnected if their internal timing no longer matches. When you are ahead, you are often living with the consequences of insights others have not yet encountered. You have already processed questions they are just beginning to ask. You have already released attachments they are still negotiating. This creates a subtle asymmetry. You are responding from completion, while they are responding from initiation. And that gap, even when invisible, changes everything. This is why explaining yourself rarely works at this stage. Language travels slower than perception. When you try to articulate where you are, words collapse, complex internal shifts into concepts that sound abstract, impractical, or unnecessary to those who are not there yet. The more you explain, the more isolated you can feel, because the explanation itself highlights the distance. Not everyone is meant to understand you in real time. Some connections are only possible retrospectively, once others arrive at similar thresholds through their own experience. There is also a biological component to this separation. Nervous systems synchronize when they share threat perception, reward, anticipation, and emotional pacing. As your nervous system becomes more regulated, more coherent, it no longer resonates with constant stimulation or low-grade anxiety. Environments that once felt normal may begin to feel loud, draining, or strangely artificial. This is not sensitivity as weakness. It is sensitivity as accuracy. Your system is detecting incoherence and choosing not to merge with it. The mistake many people make here is assuming they must fix this gap by shrinking themselves or speeding others up. Neither works. Shrinking creates internal friction and eventually resentment. Speeding others up violates timing and generates resistance. Advancement requires tolerance for temporary solitude. Not isolation as withdrawal, but solitude as stabilization. This phase allows your alignment to consolidate without being pulled back into familiar distortions for the sake of comfort. What you are experiencing is not abandonment by the world. It is a reconfiguration of access. Old forms of connection are falling away to make room for resonance that can meet you where you are now, not where you used to be. This does not happen all at once. There is often a quiet interim period where nothing seems to replace what has faded. That emptiness can feel unsettling, but it is functional. It prevents premature attachment and allows your orientation to fully settle. Being ahead is not a permanent state of separation. It is a transitional state of refinement. The distance you feel now is the space required for coherence to stabilize without compromise. And once it does, connection returns, not in volume, but in precision. Fewer connections, deeper resonance, less explanation. But before that can happen, the system must learn to stand without constant synchronization. That is the stage you are in now, whether you named it or not. Being ahead carries a cost that rarely gets acknowledged, because it does not look dramatic from the outside. There is no visible collapse. No obvious crisis, no clear marker that something has been lost. Yet, internally, there is a slow, quiet shedding that can feel disorienting if you do not understand what is happening. The cost is not pain in the conventional sense. It is compression, a narrowing of expression, a reduction in external engagement, a subtle containment of energy that once flowed more freely. This containment is not a mistake. It is the natural consequence of outgrowing the structures that once gave your energy somewhere to go. One of the first costs is the loss of emotional echo. You may still feel deeply, but fewer environments can receive those feelings without distortion. What once felt like shared excitement, shared concern, or shared curiosity now dissipates quickly, as if there is nowhere for it to land. This can create a sense of emotional flatness that is often misinterpreted as numbness or apathy. In reality, your emotional system has become more precise. It no longer amplifies itself through collective feedback. It processes internally, quietly, without needing reinforcement. This is not disconnection from feeling. It is refinement of it. Another cost is boredom, but not the kind that seeks stimulation. It is a deeper boredom with repetition, with conversations that orbit the same assumptions, with goals that recycle familiar desires. This boredom is often accompanied by guilt, because on the surface, nothing is wrong. Life may appear stable, even successful, and yet engagement feels thin. You are not bored because there is nothing to do. You are bored because you can already see the outcome of most trajectories before they unfold. Pattern recognition collapses novelty. When this happens, motivation must reorganize around meaning rather than momentum. There is also the cost of being misread. As you become more contained, others may project narratives onto you. You may be seen as distant, aloof, unambitious, or emotionally unavailable. These interpretations can sting, not because they are accurate, but because they reveal how little language exists for quiet coherence. Society is fluent in struggle and performance, but not in stabilization. When you stop signaling through urgency or identity, people reach for familiar explanations. Learning not to internalize those projections is part of the maturation process. Perhaps the most subtle cost is the grief of outgrowing former selves. You may miss the version of you that reacted quickly, that bonded easily, that felt fueled by external validation or shared struggle. Not because that version was more authentic, but because it was simpler. Advancement complicates the inner landscape. Choices carry more weight. Silence carries more information. You can no longer unsee what you have seen, and that awareness can make earlier forms of ease feel inaccessible. This grief does not mean you want to go back. It means you are integrating loss alongside growth. Being early also means living without immediate mirrors. You are often calibrating yourself without external confirmation, learning to trust internal signals that have not yet been validated by others. This can create periods of self-doubt, not about your worth, but about your timing. You may wonder if you have moved too far ahead, too fast, if you have misread the trajectory. This questioning is not regression. It is calibration. Systems that are becoming more precise check themselves more often, not less. Another hidden cost is the temptation to dim yourself for the sake of harmony. When being fully present creates distance, it can feel easier to soften your clarity, to re-enter familiar dynamics, to pretend that nothing has changed. This is where advancement can stall, not because of failure, but because of loyalty to comfort. Choosing not to compress yourself beyond what is necessary becomes an act of self-respect. It is not about asserting superiority. It is about preserving coherence. What is rarely said is that this phase is finite. Compression is a holding pattern, not a permanent state. It allows the system to reorganize internally without external interference. The reason it feels heavy at times is because energy is being conserved, not lost. It is being redirected from expression to integration. Once integration stabilizes, expression returns in a new form, one that does not rely on constant feedback or shared struggle to sustain itself. Understanding the cost of being ahead reframes the experience. What feels like loss is often latency. What feels like isolation is often incubation. You are not waiting because nothing is happening. You are waiting because something is forming that cannot yet be expressed without distortion. And the patience required here is not passive. It is active containment, a willingness to let the system complete its reorganization before seeking new mirrors. This is the quiet work of advancement. It does not reward impatience, and it does not announce milestones. But it prepares you for a form of connection that does not require translation. A form of engagement that does not drain you to sustain itself. The cost you are paying now is the price of precision. And precision, once established, changes everything that comes after. At this stage, one of the most important realizations is understanding that you are not meant to fix the gap you feel. The distance between you and others is not a problem to be solved, and treating it as one only creates more distortion. When awareness advances, there is a natural impulse to translate it, to explain it, to bring others along so the separation does not feel so stark. This impulse often comes from empathy, not ego. But empathy applied without timing becomes interference. Not everyone is meant to meet you where you are now, and you are not meant to return to where you were just to maintain comfort. Trying to close the gap through explanation rarely works because coherence cannot be convinced into existence. It must be grown. When you attempt to articulate shifts that others have not yet experienced, language becomes inadequate. Words flatten depth. They turn lived perception into concepts that sound theoretical or unnecessary. The more you try to explain, the more you may feel misunderstood, because the explanation itself highlights the difference in orientation. This is not a failure of communication. It is a mismatch of readiness. There is also a subtle form of distortion that occurs when you attempt to pull others forward prematurely. It can create resistance in them and instability in you. When you overextend your clarity to accommodate others, you dilute it. When you rush someone else's process, you disrupt theirs. Advancement respects sequence. Every system has its own rhythm of integration, and violating that rhythm, even with good intentions, produces friction. This is why restraint becomes a form of mastery at this level. Another common response to the gap is self-minimization. You may find yourself withholding insights, softening your presence, or re-entering familiar emotional patterns to reduce discomfort in social spaces. While this may temporarily restore a sense of connection, it comes at a cost. Each act of self-compression introduces internal noise. Over time, this noise accumulates as fatigue, irritability, or a vague sense of betrayal toward yourself. The system recognizes when it is being asked to regress, even if the mind frames it as kindness or adaptability. Understanding that you are not responsible for closing the gap shifts the entire experience. Responsibility here does not mean withdrawal or indifference. It means precision. You are responsible for maintaining your coherence, not for managing others' reactions to it. This distinction is subtle but critical. When you stop trying to adjust yourself to be understood, something stabilizes internally. Your energy stops leaking into explanation and begins to consolidate into presence. Presence is the only contribution that travels cleanly across timing differences. You do not need to teach, persuade, or perform your awareness. A regulated, coherent system influences its environment without effort. It sets a tone. It creates a reference point. Others may not consciously recognize it, but their nervous systems do. This is how alignment spreads naturally, not through instruction, but through exposure over time. And even then, it only spreads where readiness exists. There is also a relief that comes with releasing the savior impulse. You are not here to wake everyone up. You are not behind if others do not follow. Advancement is not a race with spectators. It is an internal reorganization that unfolds independently in each individual. When you let go of the need to be accompanied at every stage, the isolation softens, not because others suddenly understand you, but because you stop demanding that they do. This does not mean you become passive or silent in all contexts. It means you speak when resonance is present and remain quiet when it is not. You learn to feel for alignment before offering insight. You allow curiosity to come to you instead of pushing clarity outward. This selectivity is not arrogance, it is efficiency. Energy spent where it can land returns multiplied. Energy spent where it cannot dissipates. The gap you feel is not an error in the system. It is a buffer. It protects both you and others from premature convergence. Over time, as environments shift and people evolve, some of those gaps will naturally close. Others will remain without conflict or drama. Understanding this frees you from the exhausting work of maintenance. You no longer have to hold together dynamics that are meant to change. What remains is a quieter, steadier way of moving through the world. You allow difference without needing to resolve it. You allow distance without interpreting it as rejection. And in doing so, you conserve the very coherence that made advancement possible in the first place. This is not disengagement. It is alignment without attachment, and it is the posture that allows the next phase of connection to emerge naturally, without force. What happens next is not a dramatic reunion, or a sudden influx of understanding from the world around you. The environment does not rush to meet you with applause or recognition. Instead, something far more stable begins to occur. Timing slowly synchronizes. Not with everyone, but with the right structures, the right people, the right contexts. This is how advancement completes its arc. It does not circle back to restore what was lost. It moves forward to establish what can now exist without strain. As coherence stabilizes, connection returns in a different form. It is quieter, less frequent, but unmistakably clean. You may notice that when resonance appears, there is no need to explain yourself. Conversations unfold without effort. Silence feels shared rather than awkward. There is a mutual recognition that does not rely on shared history or identical beliefs. This kind of connection is not built, it is revealed. And it often arrives when you are no longer searching for it. The reason this takes time is because environments, like individuals, must reorganize to support higher coherence. You cannot sustain alignment in spaces that require constant performance, urgency, or identity reinforcement. As your system settles, it naturally gravitates toward contexts that can hold it. This might look like changes in work, creative direction, daily rhythm, or social exposure. These shifts are not strategic. They are structural. You find yourself where regulation is possible without effort. One of the clearest signs that timing has synchronized is the return of energy. Not excitement or adrenaline, but usable energy. The kind that allows you to engage without depletion. When connection is aligned, it does not drain you to sustain itself. It feeds back into coherence. You leave interactions feeling more present, not less. This is the opposite of what came before, where engagement often required self-compression or emotional labor just to maintain harmony. You may also notice that the isolation you once feared no longer defines your internal state. Solitude remains available, but it is no longer heavy. It becomes neutral, even restorative. You are no longer waiting for others to catch up in order to feel whole. Wholeness has decoupled from external synchronization. This shift is subtle but profound. It means connection is now an addition, not a requirement. At this stage, fewer lessons repeat. The patterns that once circled back demanding attention lose their grip. When misalignment appears, it is detected early and corrected gently. There is less need for breakdowns or dramatic wake-up calls. Sensitivity has replaced shock as the primary feedback mechanism. This is how maturation expresses itself, not through intensity, but through efficiency. It is also here that trust deepens, not as belief, but as familiarity with your own regulation. You know what coherence feels like in your body, in your decisions, in your timing. When something pulls you out of it, you recognize it quickly. You no longer override that signal for the sake of opportunity, validation, or belonging. This discernment is not rigid. It is responsive. It allows you to engage fully when alignment is present and to step back cleanly when it is not. What many people misunderstand is that being ahead does not isolate you permanently. It isolates you temporarily until alignment can support connection without compromise. The loneliness you felt was not a prophecy. It was a transition. And transitions end when integration completes. Not all connections return. Some were only meant to carry you to a certain point, but what emerges in their place is more precise, more sustainable, and more honest. You are no longer oriented toward proving your depth or translating your awareness. You move with less urgency to be seen and more confidence in being aligned. This does not make you invisible. It makes you clear. And clarity attracts without effort. The world responds differently to someone who is no longer negotiating their presence. The final resolution of this phase is not belonging in the conventional sense. It is alignment without isolation. You can move between spaces without losing yourself. You can connect without shrinking. You can remain distinct without feeling separate. This balance is not achieved through strategy. It emerges naturally when timing completes its adjustment. If this resonates, it is because you are already living inside this shift, even if you could not name it before. The isolation was never the truth of who you are. It was the space required for coherence to take shape, and now that shape can hold connection without distortion.